Well, hello everybody, and welcome to another edition of Speaking Of. I'm your host, Steve Weissman, the InfoGov guy, and I am just so pleased to be joined today by Elizabeth Weeks, who does records management for a living in one of the provinces to our northwest, I guess. I'm in Boston, and she's in Alberta. She works for the Alberta School Employee Benefit Plan, which I won't begin to pronounce the initials of. But I will say thank you for joining us. Welcome. And the reason you're here, among others, we recently met at a conference and we got to chatting briefly about information governance and, as I recall you put it, and its desperate need for a makeover. Mm-hmm. So I wondered if you could expand upon that a little bit and maybe even a little bit about, well, how you came to that conclusion. Did something happen at work where you're trying to explain something and everybody gave you the Scooby-Doo head tilt, of lack of understanding? So do tell.
Okay, well, first off, I'm going to just clarify that these are my opinions and not necessarily the opinions of ASABP.
Fair
so
enough.
A little housekeeping piece there. I've been in information management for about 20 years. And so I started really getting into it when you saw a lot of digitization projects and those kinds of things happening. And then moving away from this idea of information management into information governance. And we were chatting at that conference, and there was a long discussion about definitions and what definitions were being used. And, we can very easily get caught up in our own jargon and expect people outside of our industry to know and accept and be deeply familiar with our own jargon. And that was sort of the impetus for our conversation, because we were at the conference and there was a lot of discussion about, what data means and what records means in the different disciplines that kind of work with us. And I relayed a conversation that I had with my husband when we were out for dinner, and we were having something that had a garlic aioli with it. And my husband was like, "What's aioli?" And I went, "It's just mayonnaise." And a lot of the times we get stuck up on specific definitions, and we need to realize that to most people, it's just mayonnaise. Like it's easy for them to turn their ears off when we start getting into these in-depth conversations instead of putting it on a level. And I don't mean that in a condescending way, putting it in their language and what makes sense to them. And an example of that is where we can get caught up on that specific definition of a record, that ISO 15489 standard of what is a record. But the fact of the matter is, if the end user thinks that it's important enough to keep, chances are it's important enough to keep. And whether it meets that specific definition of a record or not, we should be treating it like one. And so kind of taking that the next step, when we get into information governance, it kind of needs a little bit of a rebrand, because particularly with the pandemic, people are no longer having centralized records management or information management. And that's even more true for data. It's happening at such an incredibly accelerated pace. So many things are decentralized. The repositories of unstructured information are just expanding at incredible rates.
Yep.
There is no way that we in the profession can do it all on our own. Even if we got AI, we can't do it all on our own.
Especially if we got AI.
If you get
I'm a little bit
AI
skeptical.
implementation, it would be really, really bad. But we have to get people to understand that, that's not just our department anymore. Like, everybody has a role to play to some extent or another, and they need to understand what their role is and the extent of their role is. And if we make it too specific to our industry, they didn't go to school to become records administrators, like you or I. They didn't take courses on their degrees, whether that's right or wrong, on information governance. The fact of the matter is, for the most part, they don't care. They don't. They
That's
want to
right.
know, can they find their stuff? Will it be there when I need it? Is it going to come back and bite me in the butt later on?
Yep.
That's really what they care about. So make it about what they care about. And there are some exceptions. There are some positions that exist from organization to organization where it is in their job description that they need to make sure that there's fire integrity or other things like that. Those audiences you can have more in-depth conversations with, but other audiences you need to make it about what they're concerned about and look at those pillars of information governance and just sort of, I don't want to say edit, but that's kind of where I'm going, to make it be about what they need to be. And it doesn't need to be super complicated. And it really kind of comes down to this sort of IT idea of don't try and make it perfect, just try and make it better.
Yeah.
And if it's
Oh,
continuous improvement, then you get somewhere.
no, we, and by the way, for folks who maybe this is your first edition of this little program, I don't just invite people I agree with on to be guests, but in this case, I mean, you were so right. Um, I have this thing I often describe as "we know what we mean" syndrome,
Yeah.
and we talk about stuff, and we know what we mean, but that doesn't mean anybody else does. And given, to your point, the breadth of the departments and the functions that we need to embrace to do information right, we need to understand basically how to market the concept.
And I think you just had a really good phrase, which is doing information right. We can call
I
it
even
governance.
trademarked it. It's on my website and everything.
You know, we can call it governance, we can call it things, we can change the name of it, but that's really the nuts and bolts of it, isn't it?
I think so. And the way you described what people are really after, I think is absolutely perfect. I got to be able to find my stuff and not have it come back to bite me. And you know, when you come right down to it, in terms of the positioning of this within an organization, to me, it's something I've actually said as a consultant who's been brought in. It's like, look, I'm here because the people that put me in place want to make sure you understand that we're trying to do this for you and not to you. And this is your opportunity to speak up and tell me what hurts. Can't promise it's all going to get done ever, or certainly in a first phase, but it can't get addressed if we don't write it down.
I think one of the other parts about, do it for you is really setting up systems in a way that deal with that rot stuff,
Yes.
and so that they do not have to go back and re-look at it. Set it up at the beginning so that when those expiry dates come up, and that's a great way of explaining it, it's an expiry date, that they're not the ones responsible for cleaning out the records management fridge. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing kind of type implementation. Don't run down that, because scope creep will kill you.
Yeah.
You'll find one thing, and then you'll find the next thing, and then you'll find the next thing, and you'll throw your hands up in the air and not know how to deal with it. Start with something small, start with something impactful, and it doesn't have to be perfect, it just needs to be better. A lot of the times organizations are not, into the whole perfect thing, they're into the better thing, because they don't have the money to chase better, or they don't have the money to chase perfect, sorry. It's, so get it a little bit better. Get it, solve some pain points, get that goodwill, and then build it from there.
No surprise, we do a lot of maturity modeling for organizations, which can be heavy duty, deep, take 6 months, or can be much lighter than that, depending on the scope. And but one of the first things I do tell people, to your point exactly, it's 5-point scale typically. Pretty much any model you're going to look at, you don't want to be 5, because you get into the 4s, you quickly run into the law of diminishing returns.
Yeah.
So investing in perfect, that's the wrong threshold. You really, and you want to understand for a particular organization which areas do you really need to boost? Maybe they don't all have to be 4.5 on that kind of relative scale. Maybe you got a bunch of things and they're in the 3s and it's okay. Fine, leave those and focus on the ones that aren't. I often talk about managing your stuff because I don't want to get involved in, is that data or is that information or is it, because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter.
It doesn't matter, like don't get stuck up on, oh, but ISO 14589 says that is not a record. Like a blank form is not a record. Okay, a blank form maybe isn't a record. Or maybe a social media post isn't technically a record, although I know plenty of people who will argue with me over that one. It doesn't matter. Don't waste your time trying to figure that part out. If somebody says, if some subject matter expert says, I need that, or we've had it happen where we've needed to prove X. Mm-hmm. If it's happened once, there's a high likelihood it's going to happen again. Treat it, the same way that you would anything that's really important.
No, I see. We are really very much on the same, I guess, virtual page. We're done with the hard copy pages. But yeah, I do think, just taking it one step further, a lot of places make it a whole lot harder than it really has to be.
Yeah.
Now, at the same time, and I go back to my snide remark about AI, you or someone has to write herd on it as a human person, rather than just relying on the tools. Because, as you say, and I agree with it completely as far as it goes. If somebody's keeping it, there's probably a reason to keep it. But then, and as well as I do, I mean, I had a client and we started plumbing the depths of the shared drives, and I kid you not, there are pictures of the baby, there are ultrasounds, and then there's pictures of the baby right after being born, and the office party, congratulations. And an unattended engine won't be able to discern that's not really a record, even though it's been there forever.
Yeah, there needs to be a little bit more around that, but that's where, we need the rebrand. Like, we need to explain to people that it isn't about you. It's not about your stuff. It's about, so first of all, the stuff isn't yours. It's the organization's. And there has to be a business reason for whatever we're doing. It can't be, oh, I think I'm going to need that, or I worked really hard on that. Those are not valid business reasons. But when you start framing things in terms of what's your business reason, then you get somewhere. I would also caution, when you're talking about, and in some ways this is information governance, in some ways this is more the old school records management kind of type model. But I really would caution people from keeping things longer than what their legislative requirements are. That ties a little bit more into that risk profile that an organization may have. It depends. Like, I've worked with organizations that are just like, that's what the lawyer's for, and they'll keep everything.
Yeah,
they will keep absolutely everything, and your mind gets a little bit blown. And then I've known some who are, that's who the lawyers are for, who they get rid of everything because they're paying the lawyers to argue the other side.
Right.
You have to know the culture of your organization and where they kind of stand on that before you walk in the door and start proposing what you want. Like, you got to know your audience. And I think that's really where we come down to the rebranding, is knowing your audience. It's a key thing. If you have communication people that you work with in your organization, get to be really good friends with them, because that's their whole bread and butter, is knowing their audience and knowing what the messages that you want to move on, and or what you really want. What are the key points you want? And don't make it complex. Like, keep it to one or two things. And that's where you go when you're talking to somebody outside of our disciplines.
Speaking of knowing your audiences, I know that the audience for this loves what you're saying and is really appreciative, as I am, that you took the time out to chat with me, to chat with us today. The fact that we violently agree with one another is just an icing on the cake. But again, thank you very much. Folks, I'm talking beyond you now to to the audience here. Love to know your comments on this subject, the need for a rebrand or a makeover for information governance, and hear any of the experiences that you've had that suggest maybe we need one or maybe we don't, because maybe it's not an issue where you are, and I'd love to learn about that too. And Elizabeth, I'll be sure to share anything that I learned that might be interesting, or you're obviously welcome to chime in too. Mm-hmm. This will get posted on LinkedIn and on the Holly Group site and anywhere else I can find a slot to insert it. So keep those cards and letters coming.
Sounds great.
Thank you so much again. We'll talk soon. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
This has been Speaking Of with Steve Weissman, the InfoGov guy, a Holly Group production.